Welcome to our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold. With me today, I've got Wayne Chamberlain. Wayne, welcome to Billings, Montana.
I'm glad to be here. It's
Wayne,
a great place.
I tell you, you shared with me some of the videos you took of people who had so much impact on wildlands here in Montana. And one of those videos is about a guy I have huge respect for, and that's Jim Posewitz. Tell me about Jim.
Jim Posewitz, without doubt, no matter how many more centuries in the future we go, will always be respected as one of the premier, most notable conservationists in the history of Montana. He's a wonderful man, devoted to conservation. He's originally from Wisconsin. He came out to Montana to play football for the Bobcats. Yes, the Montana State University Bobcats. He played on a team actually that won the national championship in their division. This was back when football players played both offense and defense. Real men back in those days. And so that was one of his early achievements here in the state of Montana. Jim was his primary career was working with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, to use the current terminology, formerly Montana Fish and Wildlife back in the day. And he spent 32 years there working with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And yes, it was his career, and yes, in a way, some could say he was an agency personnel, even that term that is sometimes smudged as far as a bureaucrat, if you will. But Jim was much more than that. He was an advocate, and he did not shy away from his advocacy for wild places in Montana. Probably, in his history will judge him, one of his, if not his most monumental achievement, was leading the fight, and he started the inertia to get the ball rolling in opposition to the proposed Allen Spur Dam that would have been on the Yellowstone River just a few miles upstream from Livingston. That dam and the reservoir resulting from it would have flooded the Paradise Valley. And the Paradise Valley is called the Paradise Valley for a reason. It's beautiful there. Still productive ranch country.
Good fishing too.
Good fishing. The river is beautiful. The Absaroka Range on one side, Gallatin Range on the other. It's just an incredible place to be. And Jim was instrumental in what ultimately was a success in stopping the building of that proposed Allen Spur Dam. And that is so important, not only for the Paradise Valley, it's important for the farmers and ranchers, the agricultural people and their prosperity and the productive ranch land, farmland along the Yellowstone, which is now the longest free-flowing river in the contiguous 48 states of these United States, over 700 miles. And we can thank Jim Posewitz for that.
Thank you, Jim Posewitz.
So we're meeting today with Jim Posewitz, who's a conservation giant for us here in the state of Montana. So just a brief introductory, some comments about Jim. Jim, for many years, was working for the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for the state of Montana. The years, I believe, were 1961 through 1993. Hopefully I've got that about right.
Correct.
Has been the executive director of the Cinnabar Foundation. He is the executive director of the Orion Hunters Institute. I think that's still his present position.
No, that's passed, but I'm still on their board.
Still on the board, okay. And I think interesting, he's an adjunct professor of history and philosophy at Montana State University, which is a tie that goes back to Jim, who's basically a Wisconsinite, who came to Montana to play for the Bobcats. He got a football scholarship to play for Montana State University a few years ago. So one of his original tie-ins to come from the great Midwest, Aldo Leopold country, and come out here to the state of Montana. Speaking of that, one of the quotes that I'll start with, and I know Jim lives his life like this, and that's a quote that you learn back being a Bobcat. As long as there is time on the clock, you have to play the game.
Well, the combat is an interesting thing because when you look at it multi-generational, you see it will never go away in the human culture. I mean, we have people coming to Montana thinking they just found it, that they just found a Yellowstone River and it didn't have a dam on it, by golly. We got here just in time. Well, I'm glad they have that reaction to it. But we have to have an appreciation for the fact that Yellowstone is dam free because there were several generations now of people who stepped up at critical times to say, we value this thing as it is. It has values beyond simply generating power or slurrying coal or cooling off a power plant. Value in just being a river. It's important, I think, that we know these stories, and that's why I'm glad you're maybe capturing some of these stories, because when you study Montana history, it's always the history of how we exploited the place. Mm-hmm. And when you talk to a Montana person and say, describe your state to me, they tell you what their values are. That conversation almost never starts with the Berkeley Pit. It always starts with the Bob Marshall or the Yellowstone River or the several forks of the undammed Flathead. All of those things have been fought over in our history. But we have to also realize that every time a new generation shows up, they have aspirations too, and they may see these wild places as resources that have, that they can benefit from if we exploit them. Even though we're at a stage, I think, in our cultural evolution when we realize that that is a bargain with the devil. Within the last year, I viewed a video of some people who had floated the Yellowstone River's entire length, from the park down to its junction with the Missouri River in North Dakota. And this was the story of their float trip. And as I was watching that story unfold, they went through the Allen Spur Dam site without mentioning it. They went through the city of Livingston without mentioning Dan Bailey. Mm-hmm. And they were doing this beautiful narrative with people they met along the river and stuff all the way through the state. And about a third of the way through it, I got to thinking, holy mackerel, this could have been absolutely great if they had known something. Mm-hmm. If they had known about the battles for the Allen Spur, and if they had known about Dan Bailey, and if they had known about the struggle we had in the early 70s to keep that river from being diverted into the coal fields. Mm-hmm. And then about another third through the movie, I said, wait a minute. They love what they're doing, and they love that river, and the river is talking to them. And they are experiencing those values, and maybe it's just as well if they didn't start railing on what these old guys did. And so I came out of there thinking they did a great job, because they humanized the river and the people living along it, and they clearly appreciated it. And I concluded it's better the river speaks to them. And that's what was happening there. Well, Gifford Pinchot said it best. And I don't think anybody follows Gifford Pinchot's advice in the Forest Service anymore, but at the time, he would get these young people that were going to be put out into the field to manage the national forests. And his advice to them was, use the press, first, last, and always. And I wasn't aware of that till recently, but I know when we were in the campaign for the Yellowstone River in the 70s, when there was a proposal to take a third of its flow to cool power plants and slurry coal out of Montana, or make Montana what they called at the time the boiler room of the nation. And that was the North Central Power Study and the Montana-Wyoming Aqueduct Study, both massive assessments made by the industry and the federal government. At the time, there was no way you could get an in-stream flow right for fisheries. The Montana water law required a point of diversion if you were to establish a water right. And of course, if your objective is to leave it in the stream, you don't have a point of diversion. In 1969, I think it was, we got a concession for 12 streams, portions of 12 of the Blue Ribbon streams that was introduced by a legislator from Kalispell named James Murphy, and we call that Murphy's Law. And while it was a good philosophical statement, it was protecting, the headwater trout fisheries, and it was a good idea, and we were happy to have it. But as far as going to entire river systems, we had nothing, no way of claiming water for fish. So it was necessitated that we mount a defense to prevent the Yellowstone from being dammed, and we started that in 1972, but in the 73 and 74 period, the Montana water law was rewritten. But rewriting the law and convincing an entire, society that leaving these rivers flow and run out of stream if necessary was not a bad idea. So we had to do a big public relations communication. And we, at the time, again, was the Montana Department of Fish and Game then, which becomes Fish, Wildlife, and Parks now. But we put out special issues of the magazine. We created a movie called the Yellowstone Concerto. And then we struck the jackpot. Because through Trout Unlimited, a nonprofit that we were in communication with while this whole thing was going on, discovered that there was a whiskey company in Kentucky, Glenmore Distillers, that was going to introduce a new brand of bourbon. And the new brand of bourbon was to be introduced with a tennis tournament. And they were going to spend $40,000 doing that. And the TU guy says to the whiskey guy, look, why don't you spend that money in the project to try to save the Yellowstone River? Because the name of the whiskey they were going to introduce was Yellowstone Mellow Mash. But as that turned out, they agreed to finance a national press tour about saving the Yellowstone River. And so we held this press tour. I think Schwenden was a lieutenant governor, and he welcomed the guys. And these were writers from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Life magazine was coming back into production. There was a whole array of them. And the sporting journals. But at any rate, Schwenden welcomed them. Lieutenant Governor Schwenden welcomed him, told him to get the other side of the story and all that. We flew them over in small planes over the coal fields and the power plant under construction at the time. Landed them at Livingston, took them up to Chico Hot Springs, fed them. And then we gave our presentation about the values of the river, made available the names of people who were on the other side of the debate at the time. And then the next morning, the next day, a river fishing guide by the name of Ray Hurley, who lived in Livingston, had lined up guides for each of the journalists. And the guides, an outfitter from river guides, took them down the Yellowstone River for a day. And we got coverage. In fact, the month the Board of Natural Resources had to make the decision on whether to leave the water in the river or make it available for other uses, we had 10 pages of full color in Life magazine, Great River in Crisis. And it was potent. And so the answer is you gotta be out there speaking to the masses, to the people. Because these values are in the people, and they just have to hear that they're being represented and that their support is needed. And in a democracy, that's the only way it can work. Because our opposition generally has the money and the resources to have the political access they need. And the only way you can balance that is to have the people. And so we've poured a ton of energy into public communications about what we were doing and why.
Jim Posewitz was one of the great ones. He would talk truth to power, and he got things done. If it wasn't for Jim Posewitz, we'd have a 380-foot dam sitting up behind Livingston. Paradise Valley would be absolutely flooded. Randy Newberg, who is very much an outdoor advocate and one who defends our outdoor heritage all the time, did a series of films which he called On Your Own Adventures. These are great films, and Randy had a chance to interview Jim Posewitz on the upper Yellowstone River. I think you'd like to see this piece of film.
The Yellowstone it's magical. It's the last great example we have of how a Great Plains, Northern Rockies river system should function. It's really hard to find this anywhere else. The one thing that sets the Yellowstone apart from most other rivers in this part of the world is that it's able to maintain its natural flow regime, meaning that there are no dams that alter the discharge on the Yellowstone from top to bottom. So in the 70s, there was a proposal for a dam to go in on the Yellowstone just upstream of Livingston called the Allen Spur Dam. And had that dam gone in, that certainly would have changed how the river functions down here. Because it didn't go in, we still have a relatively intact native fish assemblage. So we're in the upper Yellowstone, inside Yellowstone National Park. This is a stronghold for Yellowstone cutthroat. Oh, that's a nice fish. Oh man, I'm done. I'm retired. I'm not topping that one. Just first time I ever fly fished. Up at a couple hundred yards up the river. 20 years ago, my folks brought me up here. That's cool. It was an amazing experience, and I'll never forget giant cutthroat swimming by, and I'd never think that I'd get the opportunity to live in Montana, much less spend 5 years of my life on the Yellowstone. And ever since then, it's found a way to weave into my life, both personally and professionally. The Yellowstone, it offers just about anything you could want from a fishery. There's a variety of fishing opportunities that it offers and a variety of just recreational opportunities. I was super excited to get involved when Randy gave me a call to see if I wanted to spend a week or so fishing the river from top to bottom to showcase what the Yellowstone offers. You know, Randy's so busy these days, it's hard to track him down, and getting the opportunity to meet Jim, I couldn't say yes fast enough.
So Jim and Gail,
paradise.
this is Mike. Michael.
Nice to meet you, Mike Duncan.
Michael Duncan, okay.
One of the things I've most looked forward to is getting the chance to meet Jim. He's done just phenomenal work throughout his career over the last 50 years throughout Montana to help conserve many of the fisheries throughout the state, whether it's the Yellowstone, the Blackfoot. He's been all over and done a lot of great work throughout the years and is well known throughout the fisheries community. So it's I've heard about him and read stories about him and know about his work on the Yellowstone, but I've never had the opportunity to meet him. Without his hard work and others like him, we wouldn't have the Yellowstone we do today.
That cushion seat in the front, Mark?
Oh my God, I never had anything so good.
Captain's chair right here.
As much as I've known Jim for more than 25 years, it was probably 5 years into our relationship before I learned about the Allen Spur Dam. And people around here, locals here, started telling me, oh, I see that you hang out with Jim. Do you know the story of the Allen Spur Dam? And I didn't. Finally, one day I said, Jim, I need to know the story of this Allen Spur Dam. He said, well, how much time you have? And I said, Jim, I have a lot of time for that story.
Good evening. 3 weeks ago, I spoke to you about the national energy crisis and our policy for meeting it.
If you were around in the 1970s, you remember the long lines at gas stations as a result of the OPEC nations and their oil embargo. It created an energy crisis in the United States.
Richard Nixon was our president. He called for Project Energy Independence.
I have appointed an Energy Emergency Action Group.
And the Allen Spur Dam was one of those projects put forward.
Congress, the federal agencies, the energy corporations, the President of the United States, all piling on to cool their power plants. And what they needed was a third of this river, essentially to dry her up. We sent 3 guys here to fight that. In time that would grow to 26 people spread the full length of the river, looking at everything we could think of to look at.
And in doing that, they were accumulating the information to do what was right for wildlife and the river. Jim's team put that puzzle together and made the case that this river needed every piece of it to be intact. And those findings put them in a situation where they had no choice but to stand up and take the arrows on behalf of the Yellowstone River.
You don't go into a battle without having the truth on your side. And we could stand before power if we had the truth.
Most everyone here in the community, whether it's the anglers, the farmers, the ranchers, have an appreciation for what the Yellowstone offers. Had Allen Spur gone in and we'd be sitting under a reservoir now, that definitely would have changed the dynamic in Paradise Valley and the surrounding communities. It would have displaced farmers here in the valley, a lot of ranches here in the valley that have been here for well over 100 years.
When I asked Jim, how did you pull this off? This is David and Goliath in the classic sense. And he gets his smile and he says, well, you just got to pull out every card you have. You got to talk to every person you know, reach out to anyone who might be helpful.
Share your home search on Realtor.com.
You go to your court of last resort, and that's the public. That's where the power in a democracy resides.
As a shareholder, you get better rates and better service.
We realize we have got to launch a major public education process. A guy named Tom Perro, who was CEO of Trout Unlimited at the time, somehow he learned that Glenmore Distiller was going to come out with a new brand of whiskey called Yellowstone Mellow Mash. They were going to hold a tennis or golf tournament to introduce their new product. And Perro thought, why don't they take that 40 to 50 grand and invest it in a campaign to save the Yellowstone? And I'm thinking, that's a really good idea. We'd never done anything like that before. Well, there's quite a potential here to make this a national issue. Press tour gets set up, held after fall equinox, because I wanted snow on the Absarokas and I wanted the cottonwoods golden. We had reporters coming from Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Penthouse even showed up. Put them in small planes, and this is all being paid for now by Rand Public Relations with Glenmore Distillers' money. Flew them over Yellowtail Dam, flew them over the coal fields, and then landed them in Livingston, drove them up to Chico, threw them all into plunge, and then the next day gave them a briefing from our scientific studies of the river. And they all got at least 10 miles of Yellowstone River floating fish. Within days, the stories started coming out.
They use their platforms to take the case to the American citizen and lay it out as here is what we are putting up as the sacrifice for energy independence. And when America got to see that story, they said, no way, this is not going to happen. And because they prevailed, I can stand here right now and look at the Yellowstone River as still the longest undammed river in the lower 48.
Our Montana has been working to save the Yellowstone River for almost 2 decades. We worked with the conservation districts to get extremely good conservation and environmental data on the river. Although we don't have a dam on the river now, that doesn't mean it's not threatened. In front of me are the Beartooth Absaroka Mountains. I see some snow beginning to fall up there. Get a little skift of snow. We hope for a big snowpack this winter. The climatologists tell me that there's good news, and that is that it's likely that the Beartooths will get as much moisture as they have historically. That's a good thing, the snowpacks being large. The bad news is they expect that these longer summers and warmer springs with rainwater on top of that snow will cause the Yellowstone River to flush off much earlier. That denies water for irrigators, it denies water for our urban areas, and for crying out loud, we do not want to dry up the Yellowstone River with its fish and its wildlife and all of its wonderful habitats. This Yellowstone River is a very special resource. There's no other river like it in the United States. And we can't assume it's going to be the way we enjoy it now forever. It will take citizen action and people taking care of it, people being alert to those things that threaten this river to keep it the way it is. The individuals that you've seen in this program, Wayne Chamberlain, Jim Posewitz, Randy Newberg, work hard to preserve this outdoor heritage that we now enjoy. These wildlands and rivers that flow free, full of fish and wildlife. These are important things that we enjoy here in Montana. And it's going to take citizens like you and me to keep up that work, to keep these places for our future generations. Thanks for watching this program.